Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1750s to 1857, today we will talk about the peasant resistance to the colonial rule. As all of us are aware that how during the colonial period British they exploited Indians in every way, and peasants or the peasantry they were also not an exception, and how the kind of economic policies which were followed by the British in the context of the land revenue settlements, in the context of the commercialization of agriculture, their claim to the excess land revenue demand, then in the context of the tribals, the appropriation of the areas, or the way the customary rights of the tribals they were being denied to them. So all these kinds of things we find during the period of the British, and when the peasants they felt that they did not have much to sustain themselves, they revolted against the British, and we find that at different places we have numerous kinds of resistances in the context of the colonial rule. And some of the scholars they have argued that if we see these kind of resistances, these resistances were pre-political in nature, and on the other hand the scholars, the nationalist scholars, they have tried to see these resistance in the framework of some kind of precursor to the national movement. So these peasant resistances, scholars like Ranjit Guha, those who are seen as some sort of a proponent of the subaltern studies, he has argued in this framework that these peasant resistance they were political in nature. They cannot it cannot be said that they were pre-political in nature, because peasants they had that kind of a consciousness, they were aware about what they were doing, and with that particular kind of a consciousness, keeping in mind the kind of even the results which might be inflicted on them, the peasants they participated in these kinds of resistances. So we have a variety of viewpoints with regard to that, and on the one hand the people or the supporters of the colonial rule they argue that they were pre-political in nature, and on the other hand we have the scholars, those who find this kind of a consciousness among the peasants. And finally we find the revolt of 1857, that how even during this period where before the revolt of 1857 we have a variety of peasant resistances and tribal resistances or revolts against the colonial rule. If we tend to see the kind of references, then Kathleen Gough's article Indian Peasant Uprisings, Ranjit Guha Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency, Ranjit Guha's essay The Prose of Counter-Insurgency in Subaltern Studies Volume 2, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's From Palasi to Partition, History of Modern India. So these are some of the references which you can refer while trying to understand the peasant resistances or the peasant revolt against the colonial rule. When we try to see these movements, then we find that some of the scholars they have tried to see as in a way that they were not premeditated, they were some sort of spontaneous kinds of movements. But on the other hand, this has also been in a way rejected by others, that how these were very well planned and they were political in nature as well. So this kind of premeditated kind of revolt, that has also been argued by the scholars like Ranjit Guha, and they suggest that they were quite open in that sense. And in the context of domination and subordination, we find that the peasants they revealed the basic understanding of the relationship of domination and subordination, and this was political in nature. It was a political relationship, and the awareness of it was political consciousness, and any task to revert it or subvert it is a political task. So scholars like Ranjit Guha they have argued in this particular kind of a framework that how we have to see these ideas, and when we tend to see the kind of policies which were followed by the British, then we find that the revenue demand of the East India Company was very high, and since they got the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa in 1765, and after that East India Company engaged itself in the collection of the revenue and the way the various land revenue settlements they were being imposed on the Indian masses, and all these revenue settlements, land revenue settlements, they made land as some sort of a private property. That was the kind of idea, especially in the permanent settlement. And this kind of a change in this context, that how the land control and the authority changes and the various kinds of commercial practices which were followed by the British, this brought some kind of resentment among the masses. And we find that the nexus of the Sarkar, Sahukar and Zamindar, all these three basically was in a way exploitative for the peasants and for the other classes as well. And the issue of railway construction, we find that it also in a way created a lot of problems for the peasantry, that how it also led to deforestation. So there were a number of issues which were connected in the context of the idea of development which British had at the expense of the destruction of the flora and fauna. This is what we find especially in the context of the peasants, especially in the context of the tribal areas, and how the peasant resistances they have been seen by the various scholars, that how Kathleen Gough she has argued that there are 5 categories of the kind of revolts or resistances in the context of India, and restoring the traditional authority and the agrarian form of life. That is the first one, which is the restorative kind of a revolt. And Rudrangshu Mukherjee has also argued that the restoration of the traditional and the moral universe of the peasant society was one of the categories which we see in this context. Then we have the secondary movements, in which there is an emergence of a new form of leader who is claiming some kind of messiah status and revival of a golden age. Third one is social banditry, which is more current in European movements than in the Indian movements. So we find that the different kinds of categories which have been talked about by Kathleen Gough, where the leaders, those who are coming on the stage, they claim that they are some sort of a messiah, they are the people, those who will in a way get rid of the kind of problems which are there in the society, and some kind of a golden age will come in which people will be more comfortable. We also find that in the context of fourth stage, the kind of terrorist attacks which were being made by the peasants, that was considered as the fourth stage, and the fifth one was the mass upsurge, which has seen by Kathleen Gough, which is of two kinds, as you can see on the screen as well, reformative as well as transformative. And reformative was one with the large upsurge base, which contained some reformist features like Bhagat movements of Bihar that helped to raise the low status of peasantry. And the transformatives were one which fought for the total transformation of society and showed millenarian elements, though in many of them the past is glorified. So we find that these are some of the kind of distinctions which have been made in the movement, and Kathleen Gough she has given these kinds of distinctions in a framework of categories, that how she has tried to see in the 5 categories in that context. And Eric Stokes for example talks about the primary resistance, which is the first phase of the traditional unmodified form of traditional structure, and secondary resistance as a millenarian movement. So we find that scholars they have tried to see these kind of resistance in different ways, and they have tried to present them in a kind of environment in which they were rooted. And scholars like Kathleen Gough or Eric Stokes, they have tried to study these peasant movements and these tribal movements and tried to reason out that the kind of features which were associated with it, and the way they could be understood by the students of history. And scholars like Ranjit Guha, when they say in the context of that how when you seek to change the established notions and the relations of power to enforce justice from your point of view, then it is a political movement. So Ranjit Guha is arguing in the favor of the peasants, and he communicates that when you are trying to change the kind of notions or the relations of power which are there in the society, that the way you want to enforce justice in the society, then it can be seen in the framework of a political movement. And definitely peasants, they wanted to bring that kind of a change. They were in a way aware of their responsibilities. They were all even aware of the kind of repercussions which will be imposed on them, or the kind of consequences which they will have to face if they will not succeed in their own resistances. And despite that, they were participating in these resistances, being fully aware of the kind of strength which British they had. So we basically find that how these political movements, they were some sorts of the way they wanted to destroy the kind of power which the British exercised. And some of the groups like Santals, they definitely openly gave some kind of intimation and information, and that how they will have their own assemblies, and that is how this kind of an open information where they are talking in the framework of the public sphere, that provides the kind of political connotation to these movements. And when you tend to see all these kinds of revolts which were there in different points of time, and how these revolts basically were not against whites, but they were against the kind of colonial authority which was there. So we understand that these kinds of revolts which were varying in number, and these revolts they were trying to communicate that the issue of attacking the foreigner was more important rather than in the context of that you don't have to just attack the foreigner, rather the colonial authority was attacked, and the people, those who were in collaboration with the colonial authority, whether they were the Indians, they were also being attacked. So being foreigner and attack on the foreigner was not important in that context, but the more important aspect, that how the people, those who were in control, those who wanted to exercise that kind of a control, they were being attacked. We also tend to see that how in a way these resistances, they have been seen in the framework of conspiracies, and how masses, they were being misled to join these conspiracies. But when you tend to understand that these ideas largely belong to the historians, those who are supporting the colonialist viewpoint, and this has been rejected by the other scholars, that how peasants, they were aware that state was very powerful, and his participation can cost him his livelihood as well as his life. So there was a lot of thought process which was going on at that point of time, and the peasant, he took it as some sort of an ultimate resort when he participated in the movement. So these ideas with regard to seeing it as just some sort of a conspiracy are considered to be naive by the scholars, those who see that it is an attempt by the colonialist historians, or the people, those who are supporting the colonialist viewpoint, that these kind of resistances, they did not have much substance in them. And we find that some of the local zamindars, etc., they also revolted, and one example is of Chet Singh, that how Chet Singh revolted, and he was being supported by the peasants of that particular region. S.B. Chaudhary has tried to see the insurrection of the deposed Nawab of Awadh, Vizier Ali, in 1799, and he argues that it had all the appearances of a national revolt like the revolt of Chet Singh, and it was supported by large bodies of people which were both Hindus and Muslims. So we find that these kinds of insurrections, these kind of resistances and revolts, they had some kind of a popular appeal as well, and how masses, when they participated in these revolts, they were in a way suggestion of the kinds of the suggestion that how in the later times we see the national movement. And in the context of South India, we see that how the polygar uprising in the Tinnevelly area, as you can see on the screen as well, which was in 1801, was a zamindari revolt, as the leaders and the members were zamindars. And while the East India Company treated them as zamindars who were holding the military service tenures, in the local peasant communities or societies, they were regarded as sovereigns who were inheriting power from the pre-Muslim Vijayanagar kingdom. So we find that apart from the various kinds of resistances in northern India, we find some kind of resistances in South India, especially the polygars, those who revolted. And the polygars, they were in a way treated as zamindars by the East India Company, and on the other hand they were seen as sovereigns by the people. So that was the kind of distinction which we find during this period. And we also find that scholars like Bailey, they say when these people, they were resisting, then they were also seen as some sort of folk heroes as well. We also find that how in the context of Travancore, how the Velu Thampi, he revolted, and he was able to have in a way mobilize a lot of military, and thereafter his revolt was crushed by the British. So we find that when you have these kind of tendencies where peasants and tribals they were revolting, then the British authority, which was quite savage in nature, as Kathleen Gough has argued that with exemplary savagery they crushed the movement. So we find that the if the peasants they were revolting in a certain region, then British they in a way they engaged in counter insurgency, and this kind of a counter insurgency, you have a lot of people, those who were singing the prose of the counter insurgency, and on the other hand scholars like Ranjit Guha and other subaltern scholars, they have criticized this or they have countered this prose of the counter insurgency. And if we find that how in some of the regions where especially the Rangpur rebellion in Bengal, where we find that there is some kind of a revolt, and during this period how the people, those who were the revenue contractors, they unleashed reign of terror during this time. And when the appeals of the peasants, they were not looked into, then they raised their own armies, they in a way equipped themselves with the primitive weapons, and then they also attacked the local court of law or kachari, and they looted the grain stores and they released the prisoners. So in a way the peasants, they were also aware that if they have to get some kind of a justice, and when their appeals for justice, they were not being in a way heard by the colonial authorities, then they had to in a way fight with them in some way. And how the colonial symbols of power like local kachari or courts of law or the grain stores, etc., they were being looted by them. And even when prisoners were released, then in a way they were attacking the authority of the state. And in this we find that how Hindus and Muslims, especially in the Rangpur rebellion, both of them, they fought together, and in a way they called their leaders as Nawabs, as they wanted to establish their own government, and how they had to levy the charges to meet the cost of their movement, because unless they will get that kind of a revenue, then they will not be able to sustain their movement. And when Warren Hastings, he sent the troops to put down the rebellion, and a lot of suppression which was brutal in nature, undertook during this time. And thereafter we see that some kind of reforms in the revenue farming system they were being introduced by the British, but when you tend to understand these kind of reforms, when they were put into practice, we find that these reforms, they were not all that effective, and the peasants, they were always at the mercy of the Sarkar, Sahukar and the Zamindar, and all three of them, all these three agencies, they were ready to in a way exploit the peasants. We also find during this time that how these peasant rebellions which were taking place during this period, the sannyasi and the fakir rebellions which were there in Bengal in 1760s and thereafter till 1800s, and how these sannyasis and fakirs, both of them, they had some they had their own particular interest in trade or usury, and at the same time the people called Gosais and Bairagis, these people, they were part of this spectrum, and both these groups, they were quite influential, they were quite wealthy, and when British, they tried to intervene in the context that they could not keep arms with themselves, or the pilgrimage routes, they were being in a way denied to them, that they cannot roam freely on those pilgrimage routes. That also happens, and because of which we find that these people, they were not happy with the colonial government. Earlier they could collect some kind of taxes from the neighboring areas which were neighboring areas where they were roaming around, but even that was being denied to these people. So they turned against the British because of the kind of attack on their privileges which were there, and we find that people like Madari fakirs, they had some kind of rent free tenures, and how they were able to retain the armed followers during the Mughal period, and they were in a way affected by the East India Company's higher revenue demands and the resumption of the rent free tenures and kind of commercial monopoly. So all these kinds of things, they affected them in different ways, and they were not being happy because of such kind of intervention by the British. And we also find during this period that their ranks, they also increased because of the various kinds of famines during this period. The people, those who were affected by famines, they also joined them, and British, we find that there was some kind of an inevitability of the conflict, because British, they were not ready to in a way leave them alone. They were there to interfere in the kinds of practices which were happening at that point of time, and they wanted to have more and more for themselves. And these kinds of things, we find that they were happening in Bengal and Bihar, where you have these sannyasi and fakir rebellions, and at the same time we also find that the different kinds of land revenue settlements which were introduced by the British in different areas, and how peasants, they were feeling suffocated because of these land revenue settlements, where they had to pay more than 50 to 55% of the produce, and at the same time, especially in the permanent settlement, they were at the mercy of the zamindars, and the situation in the Rayatwari and Mehalwari areas was also not better in that context. We also find during this period that how Tipu's Pagalpanthi sect held out a promise of a new regime and just rents, and thereafter this spirit it grew over different areas, and then thereafter it was crushed with the help of the army in 1833. So we find that in some of the peasant resistances, how religion was also being used by the people, those who were in the those who were involved in these resistances, and religion as some sort of an ideology could be seen, that how it also brought so many people together. And we also find that how at different points of times they have also been studied by the different scholars, and how in a way we find that the scholars, those who are trying to in a way justify the colonial rule, they only see it as some sort of a problem of law and order. And on the other hand, how the various kinds of tribal and peasant histories, they are seen by the nationalist scholars, and these nationalist scholars, they tend to understand them in a way where they argue that they had these kinds of seeds of national revolt, and people, they were more concerned and they were aware about what they were doing. In the next discussion, we will continue on this theme. Thank you very much.